Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this morning's panel discussion. Really excited to be here with you. My name is James Klingelhoefer. I am the North American Sales Director for World Courier. The topic we'll be discussing is near and dear to my heart. I've had a chance to work with some of our customers who are developing cell and gene therapy products from early stage clinical development all the way through commercialization. And really excited because we have a very insightful and informative group of panelists here that are joining me today. And really, I think the point of today's discussion is to discuss and address some of the challenges that are related to the scale-up and scale-out development of cell and gene therapy products. And if I take myself back 1 year previously, I was at the meeting in the Mesa, and all of the discussion at the time centered around, by the time we come back to the meeting on the Mesa in 2017, it's very likely that one or more of the CAR-T products will be approved. And here we are with Novartis's Kymriah being FDA approved. We're no longer talking in hypothetical terms. We're addressing a reality here where products are rapidly approaching commercialization, and it underscores the need to how do you address the supply chain for commercial effectiveness. So as most of you already know, particularly with autologous therapies, what you do or how you implement your supply chain in early stage development will absolutely impact your options and capabilities in late stage development. So during this discussion, we're going to tackle some of those challenges. We're going to hear some insight in terms of what you should be thinking about early on and how you can avoid some of the common pitfalls. So with that said, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, give you a little bit of background on their experience in the industry, and then we're going to have about 20 to 30 minutes of some questions that we'll kick around to the team, and then we're going to leave about 10 to 15 minutes for audience questions. So I hope you think of some good ones. We've got some experts up here, and I hope you take advantage of it. So with that said, Rob, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, James. So Rob Jones, I'm Global Director for Advanced Therapies at Fisher Bioservices. Fisher Bioservices is part of the Thermo Fisher Scientific Corporation. My background originally was actually in blood transfusion. So I worked for the National Blood Service in the UK. I still consider blood transfusion as the first form of cell therapy, actually going back to the 17th century, although I wasn't around then. But certainly some of the challenges that we're facing today in supply chain in cell and gene therapy is analogous to some of the early challenges in blood transfusion as well. I was also involved in the early days of cryogenic blood transfusion as well, including autologous blood transfusions as well. So here I am 30 years later, involved in some of the same challenges, and I think later on we're going to talk about aspects like standardization, which again, the blood transfusion service has faced similar challenges in the past as well, so there's some lessons learned there. So Fisher Bioservices, we're a global organization involved in the management of cell and gene therapy. We also provide, historically we've been providing biobanking solutions, as well as helping government and public institutes with their research, materials management, and now moving into advanced therapies, the rapidly growing field of advanced therapies, and attacking the challenges of global supply chain.
All right, Martin.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Martin Lamb. I am currently heading up sales and marketing at TrackCell. TrackCell is a cellular therapy orchestration platform. We work with multiple partners across the supply chain to schedule activities to provide full traceability of products from needle to needle. And yes, we've been in existence since 2012, and the product is already rolled out at multiple clinics around the world. So I'm relatively new to TrackCell, but I'm not new to supply chains. I've worked in pharmaceutical and biotech supply chains for about 25 years. So it's good to bring in some of the knowledge I've gained over my career and apply them in the cell therapy space. I think there are unique challenges in cell therapies, but there's enough parallel. We shouldn't throw away what we've learned before. So I think there's enough that we've learned over the course of developing, commercializing pharmaceuticals that we can apply to cell therapies and make sure these products are successful.
Hi everyone, my name is Claudia Silverberg. I'm the CEO and founder of Akron Biotech. We've been in the industry providing most of the ancillary materials used in cell therapy today. Those materials are a gamma of them, from cryopreservation to actually biologics from different facilities around the world that we have manufacturing right now. And I'm here basically because I have a lot of experience in standard and standardization in the industry, and I'm leading one of the initiatives in the transport and logistics. But a little bit of background on myself, I've been in the human plasma industry quite a bit for about 20-something years ago. And I understand that the same challenges that the blood transfusion has definitely are here today in the space of cell therapy and living cells that we're shipping around the world. But the good thing and the good positive side of it is that we have more technology available. So we are in a better shape to tackle many of the challenges that 30 years ago were actually well managed. Today we can have the opportunity to manage them better. And I think that that's where we are today. But standardization is needed, and the industry is actually looking forward to be able to harmonize globally the transportation of these therapies. And that's what I'm here today as part of the standard coordinating body, which I will speak a little bit more in a few minutes.
All right, thank you everyone. Ready for some fun? Okay, let's get on to the first question. So as it relates to supply chain and logistics, at what point during development do you think that most therapy owners consider or think about scale up and scale out development for pivotal trials and commercialization? And a corollary to that, do you think therapy owners allow themselves enough time to plan their supply chain for these efforts? We'll start off with Rob.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there's sometimes a dilemma with developers that there's obviously significant focus on developing the therapy, treating the patient, ensuring that the product is safe and effective. I think sometimes, though, the rapid development of some of these drugs, just by the very fact of the speed of development, means that sometimes the true complexities of supply chain in the future may be overlooked or oversimplified. We've already said earlier today that this is a very complex supply chain. Biological materials, which are very variable by nature, and supply chain, traditional supply chain for small molecule is a very well developed process. But you can apply some of the aspects of that to advanced therapies, but there are significant pitfalls that we all know about in terms of moving large quantities of material globally. And I think sometimes these complexities are overlooked, and we've come across many developers who've come across significant challenges because they hadn't planned in advance. And of course, then it may be too late to try and significantly change the processes, change the manufacturing to deal with some of the complexities. So I think in general, developers do need to think as early as possible. If this drug is going to make it through phase 1, let's not think about what we're going to do in phase 2. Let's think about what will happen in the commercial landscape. Can we really scale up this product from a supply chain perspective, or do we have to modify the manufacturing process right now? I think the other thing is that there are developers there who are hoping to out-license. So maybe they think that we can get it to phase 2 and then we can out-license it to somebody else who's probably got a better perspective on supply chain. So they maybe don't factor in that aspect early enough.
Very good. Martin, what do you think?
I think, James, if you'd asked me this question about 12 months ago, I'd have probably given you a very different answer and said, not early enough. One of the things we've seen, and with developments over the last few weeks, it seems to be crystallizing a lot of people's thoughts in terms of longer-term planning for the supply chain. I mentioned there are some parallels, but as Rob correctly said, there are a lot of differences between this and traditional supply chains. Some of the differences that spring to mind with RMAT designations, with orphan designations that are coming to a lot of cell therapies. That's time to plan is much, much shorter than it would have been for traditional drugs.
Right.
If you look at the numbers of sources for autologous therapies, the number of sources for starting material compared to traditional supply chains where we maybe had one. For Courier, for example, even for their limited rollouts in the US, they're looking at 35 potential sources of starting materials.
Right.
The numbers of steps in the supply chain, decision points, data capture points for a typical CAR-T therapy. We've done a lot of work with Horizon 2020 in Europe, and we've identified 150 different steps, all of which need to be managed or data needs to be captured. You might be able to do that manually for 10 patients. Right. What happens when you have 100 patients, 1,000 patients, 5,000 patients? It's just mind-blowing. And so I think planning for that, implementing the right IT systems to support that is going to be critical. But also, we've spent a lot of time talking about the needle-to-needle supply chain. As these products approach commercialization, as discussed in the last panel, there's a lot of work needs to be done before patients even enter the supply chain, and then at the back end of the supply chain around reimbursement. So one of our current partners actually calls it accountant to accountant rather than needle to needle.
Wow, that's interesting. Very cool. Claudia, what do you think?
I actually think that I will look into from another perspective a little bit. The supply chain is complex, but need validations, need specifications, need training. You have a lot of still human capital involved in that supply chain. And actually, because it's global, requires harmonization. So there are a couple of aspects that in the complexity of what it is, we need to look into it and what are the systems in place to gather the data. Right. Actually, when we look at the cost of the cell therapies, not only there are a couple of critical pinpoints that actually drive the cost of the therapy. One is the cost of goods, and the other one is the transportation, logistics, and the warehousing of this material. So definitely we need to look at the equation and see what can be done in the transportation side to validate, to test, to train, to be able to do all the T's, cross all the T's, the training, the traceability, the testing of the data, and generate a specification so the process can flowing very naturally and batch to batch becomes seamless. And definitely that's what I see upcoming.
Very good. Claudia, I'm going to come back to you in a second for the transportation standards piece. Rob, I wanted to ask you, during our conversation last week, you mentioned that sometimes there is a inkling of prioritization where manufacturing is the priority and sometimes maybe the supply chain gets lost in that. Do you still see that as a challenge now where we're in clinical stages, we're just focused on treating patients, that's our priority, we're not worried about the commercial feasibility? Is that kind of subsiding given all of the recent developments today?
I think Martin's quite right in saying that just a year or two ago discussions were all about how we scale up manufacturing. Now you come to meetings like this and there's significant elements of supply chain. So people are thinking about it. People are now really concerned about how we deliver to the patients. How do we increase access, patient accessibility? What happens at the site of administration? Are hospitals able, do they have the right facilities to administer these drugs? We're beginning to look at the downstream element now. So I think, to your point, developers are beginning to think, but again, we're talking about very short development cycles with a lot of accelerated access programs in the US, Europe, and Japan. Developers are finding now that the time from phase 1 to commercial could be 3 to 4 years. We're talking to one developer who hasn't really figured out what their commercial strategy will be, and it keeps them awake at night because if everything goes well, it's probably only 18 months away. So I think there is a lot of focus now on supply chain, which is great, and things have changed over the last couple of years to focus people's attention on supply chain. But there are still significant, complexities and challenges right up to the point of administration. And I think to Phil's point, what are you going to do with this with this vial of therapy that is the equivalent of the cost of a Lamborghini, and you're just going to throw it in a water bath. The chain is as strong as the weakest link, but there's a definite shift in focus now downstream to look at delivery of drug and how we get expanded access and improved efficiency to get patients treated.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. And so, Claudia, I'm going to go back to you. There was a recent article that was published about a near misdosing or miscalculation of the dosing level for a CAR T product, and this brought some buzz about is there going to be regulatory oversight for transportation and logistics. So the question that I ask is, you have so many different variables alone just with the starting material to begin with. What role do transportation standards play in the development of therapies, and do we think that there will be regulation that covers transport and logistics down the road as it relates to standardization?
Okay, let me back off a little bit. The transportation is one of the many standards being generated right now. As the panel before mentioned, 2,000 standards are going to come up pretty soon. And there is a lot of noise about that. Actually, from the 21st Century Act last year, approved last year, came out a mandate to generate the standard coordinating bodies so we can coordinate all the standardization on the industry. And the one that is coming up actually next year has to do with ancillary materials, which are the materials that are used for the cell therapy space. Some of them are complex in themselves, they're biologics and so forth, and require a little bit of attention. And also the bioprocessing, there is an ISO standard on that. ISO has been very active in the space, and ISO is a global entity, as SDO, Standard Developer Organization, that has been very active in this space. In terms of transportation, actually Japan, usually a country takes the lead, and Japan actually took the lead to start the transportation and logistics standard, which is a very interesting country to start with because they actually see the value in themselves, but still they are an island and they are small, and their scale in the logistic and transportation point of view, it's limited. Right. So definitely we gather different group of experts, and US has one group specifically that I invite anyone to participate that are looking into working on that standard. It usually takes about 2 years, the process in itself, and I think that ISO is going to be playing a big role on that. We are not reinventing the wheel. There is a lot of transportation on clinical trial materials, organ transplantation, transport. So there is a lot of things done actually on the ground. Airports are already being identified. Actually, Miami Airport, for example, is one of the airports that are being classified pharma friendly or pharma type of airport that is able and capable to receive this type of goods. There are other associations and SDOs related to clinical trials that are involved as well. So definitely there is a lot of predicate to base our work on, but still cell therapy is unique. We have secondary transportation, we have global crossover oceans, and we have ports of entry with customs. FDA sometimes is being well educated in DC, but is not well educated at the port of entry. So definitely the training of that personnel, it's quite critical to make sure that the therapies can go through seamlessly, knowing that they are a time-sensitive material or temperature-sensitive material. So definitely there is a lot of work to be done, and the standards are going to be helpful to train the personnel to be able to understand from the user perspective and from the supplier perspective what are the requirements moving forward. So definitely we will see a lot of movement in the next 2 years, and definitely I want the industry to be tuned on that because we will need the input. Every process is different, but at least the guidelines on how those specifications have to be built up will be available through this ISO document.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so, Martin, when we talked, you mentioned that we have a lot of experience to draw from large molecule and possibly small molecule that we can apply to cell and gene therapy. As it relates to standards, how do you think that will come into the equation?
I think there already are specific standards or specific requirements in both the FDA and the European regulations, both of which are evolving all of the time. We know the FDA is working on new regulations around advanced therapies.
Right.
In Europe, there were draft guidelines issued last year. Controversial guidelines, I might add, but there were guidelines issued all the same.
Right.
So there is going to be a new directive coming in Europe also. It's coming from the UK. They may not apply to us in 2 years, but not get into Brexit. But even outside of the regulations, the FDA and other regulatory bodies do recognise the need for robust logistics supply chains.
That's right.
Dendreon, when it was approved a number of years ago, during their review of Provenge, the FDA actually said it's not the manufacturing of this product, challenging though it is, that we see as being the potential problem. What we see is the orchestration of the supply chain and the orchestration of the multiple parties involved in that supply chain.
Right.
So the regulators are absolutely looking at what happens outside of manufacturing.
Thank you. Rob, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I totally agree with Claudia's comments in terms of standardization. I think in any rapidly evolving dynamic industry, what tends to happen is everybody goes off in their own direction, and then the standards come a little bit later to pull everybody together.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're beginning to see now. The development of standards to address some of the challenges. At the end of the day, we're continually talking about cell therapy as an incredibly variable product. You're dealing with biological products, which by definition will have built-in variation. You've got a multitude of touch points along the way that can add to those and amplify those variations. So it's important that standards will come along, and they will. And as Claudia says, there are groups now working on standardizing various parts along the supply chain. It's going to take time, and we need industry engagement to help define and clarify the standards. But it will happen. For example, I quote my background in blood transfusion, and I remember the time when barcoding, every centre had a different symbology of barcodes, which meant that whereas previously they just relied on human readable numbers with all sorts of human error that brought along. So everybody started incorporating barcodes, but then they realized that everybody was using different formats of barcodes. So there was no ability to help other centres by shipping blood into Europe to help for a shortage in a particular region. We couldn't help the total supply chain because of incompatibility in a barcode. We could send blood to a European site that was short of a particular blood type because we had a surplus, but they couldn't use it because they couldn't scan it with their scanners. So the ISBT at the time decided, well, we need to do something about this on a global basis, worked with the AABB in the US, and formulated a standard format of barcode, which is the ISBT 128 format. And that was an example of bringing in new technology and then suddenly realizing that everybody's doing their own thing, and there needed to be somebody to bring those a standard format. And I think we're going to see that in cell and gene therapy, whether it's labeling, whether it's packaging, whether it's the way we transport things, the way we validate processes. These are things that are gradually going to be tightened down.
Definitely. And Martin, I'm going to come to you. Another question. So in speaking with companies who are developing their cell and gene therapies, we find that automation is a critical component to ensuring scale-out feasibility. Why is automation of great importance, and what do therapy developers need to consider as they're orchestrating their supply chain?
I'll answer this more from the side of data automation, automated notifications, automated scheduling of activities across the supply chain. One of the biggest drivers of cost in any manufacturing, or any supply chain, whether it's cell and gene therapy, whether it's biopharma, whether it's small molecule, is utilization of assets. Making all of the different stakeholders across that supply chain work in tandem to maximize your utilization is very, very difficult manually without a system being in place. So firstly, automation does provide that better utilization of your assets, a more efficient supply chain. The safety aspect, if you have, I mentioned earlier on about the number of decision points in the CAR T supply chain. If you try to manage that manually, what is the risk that the wrong patient could be treated with the wrong drug, or could miss some significant upstream quality incident which impacts on the quality of the end product.
Yeah.
How difficult is that going to be to do manually?
Right.
And is a system needed to do that? So yeah, automation to me, as these products grow, as they approach pivotal trials, but more importantly commercialization, automation of data transfer across the supply chain to allow for efficient management is going to become critical. And encouragingly, from what we're seeing with clients, is people are thinking, we're actually seeing clients starting to plan for that now in preclinical.
That's good.
A year ago, quite often if I was talking to clients about this, their answer would be, well, we've only got 10 patients now, we don't need to worry about this.
Right, right.
I think, as I said right at the beginning, some of the great news that's happened in the last few weeks has had people focus more on, well, this could be us next year, we need to start planning now. So I've seen a big shift there.
That's exciting. That's exciting. Claudia, you were going to?
Yeah, I just want to add that eventually we don't know exactly how the next 5 years the business model will look like, is if it's going to be delivery of the cell therapies because of we have a centralized manufacturing, or will be a point of care, and that point of care will indicate that the transportation and logistics is perhaps within the hospital, floor to floor. So we don't know exactly how they look like, but we need to be prepared because definitely each cell therapy, it's a world in itself.
That's right.
And definitely the business model is something that will indicate, and the business model will indicate the manufacturing capacity and the manufacturing model, as well as the transportation and logistics. Everything is actually connected at the end of the day. Decentralized or centralized manufacturing is going to be a big impact in the transportation and logistics. And I think that it's important for the providers to be prepared for both at the end of the day.
I agree. Rob, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, automation is the buzzword, isn't it, in any industry that's scaling up. I think Martin raises a good point in terms of automation, the automatic collection of data and managing of that data as things scale up. I think from an operational perspective as well, automation plays an important part, or will play an important part in the supply chain of delivery of these drugs on commercial scales to patients. The only problem with automation in the manufacturing workflow is, there's a danger that automation at one point creates a bottleneck further downstream. So I think we have to look at the entire end-to-end workflow, the whole process, the vein-to-vein process, and look at where the pain points are and try and integrate automation in such a way that it prevents bottlenecks further down the line. So, for example, we're looking at, so maybe we're looking at a decentralized storage model where we're storing large quantities of cryogenic product. Technology is now available that allows for automated cryogenic storage, which is great. You can remove some of the human element there. But downstream, what happens when drug needs to be packaged and labeled, maybe multilingual labeling to go to different regions in the world? At the moment, the packaging and labeling of drug product is done manually at cryogenic temperatures. To physically automate a process that occurs at sub minus 150 degrees temperatures is a huge technological challenge. However, us as an industry need to maybe look outside the industry, and I think Phil mentioned earlier on, that there's possibly technologies that are in other industries, and GE, a bit like Thermo Fisher, touches many different industries. That just because there isn't any cryogenic automation to do packaging, within the medical or the healthcare industry, there possibly is maybe in the food industry or in other industries. So we need to look a little bit broader to look at these technologies, and as an industry and as service providers, we need to look at automation. Only with automation can we de-risk the process, increase the throughput, and decrease the overall cost, which is, as an industry, what we're all trying to do.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rob. So this is the last question before the audience free-for-all, so just let you know. Claudia, we'll start with you. As we continue to see success for cell and gene therapies, especially with the approval of Novartis's product and the advances of other products in the space, how far away are we from globalization of these therapies? And what do you think the biggest challenges to consider when we think about going to countries outside the US and EU?
Not all the regulatory, agencies or countries are at the same level of growth, and that's something that needs to be leveled at one point. Every continent, perhaps, not even continent, countries are a little bit one more ahead than the other. So definitely that needs to be leveraged in the next 5 years. I see that coming. With that, all the standardization that is going to be in parallel. So there will be several activities happening at the same time that at one point all will blend together. The supply chain automation, as Rob said, and the traceability of every single step, even the intermediate steps that eventually may be hub and intermediate step, and others will be like a mix, kind of a hybrid type of model, not necessarily centralized or decentralized, as I mentioned before. So that could open up a different regulatory environment in different places, and definitely be able to sync more the customs and customs agencies that are already in place to understand this new industry. They're very well behind, and every single continent is not only the US. So definitely there is a lot of work ahead to be done. I think that in the next 5 years we will see a lot of evolution. Again, crossing all the T's, the training, the testing, and be able to use these new technologies to help us succeed in what 30 years ago was a big challenge, and we solve it manually, perhaps, and in paper, and with more human capital and power, but with more artificial intelligence and automation, that I see that being the next generation for this industry, as disruptive as it is.
That's a really good point. So Martin, would you like to add on that?
Yeah, I'll give a couple of examples of potential problems which I think everyone should consider, especially if you're planning to globalize your therapy in the future and go into new markets. One is around Europe, especially for commercial products. Importing a product into Europe, it needs to be full specification tested and QP released before it can actually be used. That needs to be built into your supply chain if you're planning on manufacturing centrally at a location outside of the EU. That's added complexity to the supply chain. And really, you need to consider, if we are going to go into Europe with our therapies, do we need a European manufacturing base as well to avoid this potential extra step? Another bit of experience I have from working in the traditional supply chain is in certain countries where we were running clinical trials, if we were collecting blood samples for analysis, exporting those just was not allowed under their regulations. So if you are looking at an autologous supply chain and you're planning on expanding your market into a country where you can't export human material, that's going to be a big problem. And again, needs to determine how you plan that supply chain. Do you need something in that country to allow you to support your therapy in that part of the world?
Those are great points. I mean, that's something for us, having a global network. We're constantly dealing with that, helping customers with paperwork, import permit requirements, and walking them through what can and can't be done. Really interesting. Rob, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I totally agree, James. We come across that, on a very regular basis. Inconsistencies in import requirements, customs differences. Sometimes, just plain simple lack of understanding at border controls. Where people are unfamiliar with unusual shipments, dry shippers, vapor shippers. Sometimes we do have to almost educate, border staff, customs people as to what these shipments are. Now maybe in the future, when large-scale cryogenic shipment becomes, almost commonplace, some of these barriers will be easier to overcome. And I think also internal regulations, Claudia says, there's so much inconsistency from country to country. It can produce very, significant challenges. And as Martin says, if you're working in somewhere like, Russia or China, it can be very, very difficult because these aren't chemical compounds. This is human material, and some of the internal regulations don't permit the movement of human material out of the country. So developers have to decide, okay, so how are we going to meet the challenge? Do we have to invest very significantly in manufacturing within those countries? Do we have to, shall we keep the supply chain and manufacturing totally inside that country? Have all the release testing done inside the country? This adds a huge amount to the manufacturing process. But I think I'm an optimist, and I believe that some of these barriers will begin to resolve themselves as the industry matures and cell and gene therapy becomes more commonplace in therapeutic treatment of patients.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. So, all right, so I'm going to open it up to the audience now. What questions do you have for the panel?
There's a standards coordinating body of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine and other standards. We talk about standards, but I think I get the toy. So in terms of standards, can you guys touch a little bit on how you perceive or interpret the meaning of standards in terms of supply chain raw materials, in terms of transport and data?
Okay, we'll take a little bit of that. In terms of that's a good question, actually, because the transportation in the ancillary materials is one aspect. They are biologics, and they've been around quite a while, so it's not unknown, although there is still a curve for customs to be educated on those, because sometimes of those ancillary materials, perhaps they are drugs, and now they are being used in cell culture, and they are for further manufacturing, so there is no category sometimes in the customs list of what are the products, and there is some delays on that, which delay the manufacture of the cell therapy, of cells that are waiting to be treated. So there is a chain of events that actually trigger a lot of issues. So the transportation of the raw materials, what we call now ancillary materials, is being taken care of by actually this new standard ISO that is coming up next year. The transportation and logistics of cells, either raw materials as considered the cells or the finished products, are being treated in the new standard that we're trying to work right now through ISO, and that's a different one. But they're going to be separate. The ones are for biologics, and actually the raw materials for cell therapy manufacturing, which are complex in itself, are going to be coming up next year for this ISO. And the transportation of cells, either as upstream or downstream, are coming up in the next 2 years' time. They are going to be different. They trigger different events. But at the end of the day, I think that the education of the customs and the transportation and logistics partners that you use, it's key. The integration of all of it. You're integrating in the manufacturing, well, supply chain needs integration as well in the communication between all the parties all together and the traceability of that information. So it's coming up. And this standard coordinating body is very keen on that particular aspect, because transportation and logistics is actually one of the hot spots right now. Thank you.
Anyone want to add?
Yeah, just adding to that, and I completely concur with Claudia. I think as well, the logistics providers as well have a big part to play in ensuring standards are met. So, I think some of the complexities of supply chain might mean you might need multiple carriers to get the product to its final destination in front of the patient. And I think we just have to ensure that standards and the quality management of these products are really absolutely linked right to the end. So we sometimes see now, maybe due to the necessity of the importance of getting the product to the end point, that maybe some courier in some part of the world is utilised that maybe doesn't meet the standards, doesn't meet the requirements, but they're the only ones available to do that last mile shipment. That's where it could all go wrong. So I think in terms of logistics providers, providing that solid end-to-end high quality service, even if it might mean using third parties, I think is going to be an important factor.
I think even if ISO standards are in place, there is still going to be some regional variability there. That's why it's important to plan on that, to work closely with your courier, who will have day-to-day experience of doing this. That just doesn't apply at a national level. One of the things I've learned over my career is even the port of entry into the same geography, operating under the same regulations, can have very different results based on how experienced that port of entry is in handling a particular type of shipment. So I would really strongly advise that you work with your courier company to ensure there's a speedy transition of product into countries. They typically know which ports of entry are going to be successful, which are going to be problematic, and they can typically advise on that.
Yeah, and to add on to Rob's point, as a specialty courier, we look at our role is to approach with the end in mind, so looking at the commercial supply chain and applying standards throughout and bringing that company and all the vendors together to make sure that they have a commercially viable supply chain and have the standards common throughout, as Martin said. Any other questions from the audience? You get to hold that cool box.
Great.
I'll ask a question. Where do you feel is the most pressing area for standard? Where there's perhaps most divergence right now, that if you can fix one piece, you say you can fix that piece with transport logistics?
I mean, personally, I think absolutely, because without oversimplifying it, that's when things could go wrong. When it could all fall apart. That final step. We've developed the therapy, we've standardized it using GMP processes, quality management systems, right through the manufacturing process. And now all we've got to do is get it to the patient, and that's when it can all go wrong. To James's point, I think ensuring that we're working with the right logistics providers. And I know there's a lot of emphasis about reducing cost of goods, but at the same time, we've got to reduce cost of goods without cutting corners, and maybe using logistics companies who are maybe not familiar with certain parts of the world, etc., just on cost. That's when it can go wrong. So I think if we can implement standards for the logistics part, we're really strengthening that weak link in the chain. We've already got some very tight controls through manufacturing, through GMP, and following regulations, MHRA, EMA, FDA, PMDA, etc. But where it can go wrong is when it leaves the facility and it's in the big open world, and we need to get it to the patient. So I think if we can standardize that, implement some control, use the right logistics partners, that will mitigate a significant amount of risk.
I think that one of the most important things is for the manufacturers to do an incredible risk assessment of all that supply chain and be able to pinpoint the gaps themselves. This is a personalized era, so we can generalize a few things because it's common knowledge and common understanding, but at the end of the day, each therapy have their own life on their own, and they have their own personality, put it this way, and put all the pieces together has to be something that has to be worked out between all the parties all together. That's the way to de-risk it a little bit more. Everybody's agree and understand their responsibility in the supply chain, not in the supply chain itself, but the supply chain of all the processes, and everybody takes their part, the responsibility, and move forward with that.
So I think we're about all out of time, but this was a great discussion. I want to say thank you to the panelists, thank you for your contributions, and thank you to the audience. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.